also because he applies it broadly across history, as though like there weren't class systems that you were literally by law forbidden from moving up the hierarchy, no matter who you were.
Like the
That's
caste
the one that
system.
got me. Like the assumption that like literally structurally, everybody cannot move up the hierarchy.
That's all. That's all.
Okay.
That does speak to people in the voice of their conscience.
Maybe these experiences are actually pointing to something that is absolute and true and informative.
Do you think that's true?
I don't know. I'm a scientist.
Look, it's fine to be investigating it, you know.
Yeah.
Do you think it's reasonable to conceptualize the destination place of a trip as a place? We've talked about how psychedelics shed a different light on the structure of reality as we perceive it, but people also report going places that aren't here exactly. The idea, the shamanic idea that the universe is a tree, I believe that that's the tree of size, essentially, that's the realm from the subatomic to the cosmic. That's how that's portrayed in the primordial human imagination, and the shaman report traveling up and down those levels. It seems that everyone who takes DMT reports going somewhere very fast and encountering all sorts of alien entities.
We've run a number of interesting survey studies. Most of them ended up feeling that they had encountered sentient and a conscious, benevolent, often sacred other in these experiences. Most of the people claim to come out of the experience with a different sense of reality. The majority of them continue to think that the entity existed after the experience, continues to exist. In a different survey, when we asked people about God encounter experiences, and we did that naturally occurring God encounters and psychedelic occasion God encounters, it actually was much of the same story. People felt that they were in the presence of a conscious, intelligent, benevolent carrying entity, and their worldview shifted. But these were people who went into this framing it in terms of a spiritual religious experience. The DMT people, very often didn't have a religious orientation to begin with, yet they come out with these beliefs.
Do you have any ontological sense of what's happening in the DMT experience?
I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. One of the striking features of the DMT encounters was that the attributions made to the entity really mapped onto the same kinds of attributions that people describe in their God encounter experiences. If you read that DMT literature, you get other wild descriptions of, alligators and insectoids and
mechanical clowns and it's really it just makes things weirder the more you read about the experiences. Your studies in religious leaders, like, what are you doing? What motivated you to do that? I really want to know why you're doing that. What you think will happen? What the cultural significance? Because it's such a wild thing to do. Like you've already established the fact that these mystical experiences are reliably inducible, and now you're pulling in figures of significance in religious communities. It's another thing I can't believe you've managed to do. Why and what are you seeing and what do you think's going to happen?
We started out with healthy volunteers, and we've done a whole bunch of stuff with patient populations. So, where the rubber meets the road here in our culture immediately is these drugs as therapeutics, and they're going to be very powerful.
Yes, because you've had amazing success with smoking cessation, for example.
Smoking and depression and end of life, and there's good evidence for alcoholism, and there are a variety of other targets now, and the excitement is that we may have transdiagnostic efficacy because the very nature of these experiences are so fundamental to rewriting the operating system, if you will, that the kinds of changes that can come about can cut across a variety of psychiatric diagnostic categories.
Maybe we can close this off with a little bit of discussion about, the potential impact of this? I mean, I'm very interested, for example, in the decline of religious belief across the West, and there's a necessity for revitalization. And
that's the question. So among people who have made career commitments to ministry and to supporting people's spiritual growth, what happens with them with a psychedelic experience?
Do you plan to do long-term efficacy studies? Like, I'd be really curious if your psychedelic enhanced ministers, let's say, were then more credible proponents for their community and their congregations were disproportionately, for example, or perhaps not, likely to grow.
We'll certainly follow these people up. So the question is, how does this interact with faith traditions? And that's going to be an interesting story to tell and to have unfold.
People come out,
why don't we
they're
stop?
more pro-social.
So lots to unpack. If only we had somebody, who knew something about DMT and the literature on this call. Dave, you've spent a lot of time, moderating the DMT Nexus, and so much of this discussion of entities, like y'all have explored, and they use that as a jumping off, as JP was at the close of this clip, talking about how this might actually bolster the credibility of religious leaders who are using psychedelics. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to come at it from another angle. I recently had an email exchange with Roland where he asked what my current take on the sort of DMT entities and the nature of reality was. And there are two phenomenal threads on the Nexus, which we'll link in the show notes. The improbability of hyperspace, part 1 and part 2, that basically go to the notion that reality is likely stranger than any of us can conceive. And like the sort of hubris or arrogance of thinking that our human brains can somehow grasp the ultimate truth or the fundamental nature of existence or what have you has always struck me as odd. And so after linking him and running him through some of those thoughts, I concluded with the Douglas Adams line about how there's a theory or a hypothesis that states that if somebody could somehow come up with the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, the universe that exists would suddenly be replaced by something infinitely stranger. There is a second hypothesis that states that's already happened. And I think this fixation with sort of what is the truth and can psychedelic experiences give some sort of fundamental religious authority, to me is a rather odd, because I remember the first time I heard this and I thought it was a rather bizarre line of reasoning to go down. And it wasn't until Niché sort of connected it to some of the chain of being, hierarchy type constructs that Peterson engages with, where it's like, well, I imagine if you could construct some faintly plausible notion that psychedelics offer an ultimate truth, and now your religious authority is engaged in connection to that ultimate truth and is able to say, let's say even more so than like the Catholic Church hierarchy, no, I am the keeper of the wisdom and I have it directly from the source, and you don't have to trust me because here is the evidence that I'm taking the substances that connect me to the divine. It comes back to what Mildred was saying early on about the notion of needing a mediator, right? The notion that now your religious leader is in the role of the agent, and it's almost like of the agent Smith, because not only are they there potentially to accompany you should you cross that, but they are now a rogue program, on their own, capable of jumping back and forth and inhabiting all these different positions as expert. And so to me, like, it does really weird things as far as claims to authority. And frankly, like this reduction, the way I used to talk about DMT when I was doing quite a bit of it, and talking to other people about it, was like, look, generally I would say, and this is a vast simplification, but like I found it helpful to sort of think about the types of experiences in sort of three very broad categorical boxes of like, look, there are experiences that seem relevant to me or somehow tied to my subconscious, where it's like, okay, you know, I've just seen a movie and I'm seeing some of the content of that movie sort of reflected back to me. There are things that seem like they have nothing to do with me whatsoever that could be, you know, if you want to play around with ideas of collective unconsciousness or archetypes or whatever, like there's interesting content there. But then there's a category of what seem to me to be impossible experiences or impossible structures or entities or constructs, which, like, by encountering them, right, it's a paradox, right? It can't be impossible because it's existing, at least in my mind. There is some sort of experiential ability to encounter a fractal morphing tesseract, and yet for the life of me, I don't know where the fuck that came from. I also don't know that it has anything to do with any sort of ultimate commentary on reality or spirituality or human evolution or religion as an impulse that somehow drives necessary hierarchy. So, like, to me, this is almost like a more harmful version of like McKenna sort of stream of consciousness thought jamming, where it's like, cool, like this if you find religion interesting and you find the intersection of religion and drugs like fun to riff on, by all means, like, have fun with that. The problem is when you then couple it up to some of these fascistic impulses and you tie it to this overly authoritative claim of what religious structure is doing and the increasing amount of chaos in the West, like, that, to me, that's where it becomes really dangerous.
Thanks.
Sure.
Other than that,
Mildred, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's like it's interesting that they seem to be using psychedelics to make their thoughts more rigid, which is a very strange methodology. Because to me, like the one of the primary benefits of psychedelic drugs has always been that they allow you to take in new possibility and see things in new ways. But they're using it to say there is one fundamental truth, like a one idea that's like it's somewhere evident in our consciousness, that if we can just use them to get to that, everyone's going to step in line and understand like their meaning in the tapestry of the universe.
And to
and
take
that, as they're
Sorry.
talking about, oh, well, I was just going to say, I can't help thinking about Rick Doblin as we talk about psychedelics, religion, and what you just said, Mildred, about if everyone could just take these and fully realize themselves, we'd have a new globalized conscious religion, is kind of what some at least one leader in the space has discussed before.
Doblin is on the record talking about creating a psychedelic religion, spirituality for the billions. Like, no exaggeration. Like, and again, the level of hubris, like the notion that you could bring a religion or a spirituality for the billions is wild. But
isn't that
there's
the
also
explicit end game for like what he's doing? It's not just that this is like possible, but that's like the real mission for getting psychedelics into a medical framework, is to achieve that.
And he connects it to
we
Eleusis.
call it, we call it in the paper, we call it Pax Psychedelia. But yeah, go on about Eleusis.
Just
please.
2 quick points. There's a book by Nicholas Langletz called Neuropsychedelia, where Rick talks about so first he like basically decides conclusively that the Eleusinian mysteries were psychedelic ritual, ignoring whatever sort of debate or questions are still there, and then basically says, look, they were stamped out in like 396, so what maps, the mission that we're on is basically the 1600-year attempted recovery of psychedelics to a central place in Western society. And it's just like, okay, that's interesting. But then also to talk about the point that was just made about like the rigidity of thought. It's not just a rigidity of thought. Like, I've encountered, as we've gotten more and more reports of practitioners abusing participants, and there's been stories both above ground and underground, and we've reached out to a number of researchers to ask them for comment, including on like abusive practitioners that they have endorsed or held up or invited to speak. And the number of researchers who seem so down the rabbit hole, so wrapped up in this notion of uncovering the mysterious inner workings of the mechanistic, deterministic universe. And if only they can get to the end of their study, they'll have it unpacked. And they say, sorry, we're too busy. We're focusing on our core mission. We can't engage with these real world harms. It's like they've become so focused on the question of what might lie at the core of this that they could possibly unravel, that they've lost all sight of like the real world shit happening to people in their own discipline. And it's jaw dropping.
Also, with the invocation of Eleusis, and Jordan Peterson did it too. We didn't really acknowledge it, but he talked about Brian Mirarescu's immortality key, which does point to evidence that's suggestive that the Eleusinian mysteries did have a psychoactive sacrament. It doesn't definitively prove it. I personally think these stories are fascinating, but the idea that it's a goal to somehow return Western society to orient itself in the way that was done, almost 4,000 years ago, if we go all the way back to the beginning of Eleusis. One of the remarkable things about the mysteries, however they were formed, is that women and slaves were allowed to participate. Because we have to remember the ancient world, like a lot of people didn't have basic freedoms. Women were treated as chattel. Slaves were spoils of war. So even though like Cicero says that the Eleusinian mysteries was one of the greatest things that civilization had to offer at that time, we have to recall that civilization also basically ran on slaves, similar to our own civilization. Well, we just don't call them that anymore. So, the notion that somehow getting back to that is going to, bring out the best in all of us. I don't see it. It's not there.
The way they talk about psychedelics is like the anti-life equation. Like so there's a comic book character named Darkseid. He's the evil god of an evil planet called Apocalypse. His goal is to get something called the anti-life equation, which is kind of a metaphysical representation of fascism by Jack Kirby, who was kind of processing his feelings about the Second World War through this metaphor. But the idea being that to be able to rewrite someone's will is essentially is the reverse of life. But they're kind of just positing that like as an uncomplicatedly, if you can get them to quit smoking, it's okay to like erase parts of their personality. Mm-hmm. It's okay to overwrite their operating system. And then the question never seems to arise is like, aren't you kind of killing a person? Aren't you kind of like removing bits of the person's personality? And I mean, like, to be frank, I think to say that you can do that is to overstate the case somewhat. I think you're just traumatizing people into accepting what you say. But if you could, that should be very frightening to you. Mm-hmm. You should look at that and go, what if someone does this to me and takes away something about me that I value? Mm-hmm.
But what if there was a whole nascent industry that was valorizing this and that was saying, hey, in 10 years, we're going to be worth $100 billion. Like, sorry, Nishay.
And with the goal of fitting people, trying to accommodate people to the existing society. It's like if people are suffering, it's because they haven't sufficiently learned their place. They haven't sufficiently kind of like realized that or become grateful for the fact that their struggles in life are their opportunity to grow, and they need to like love that and embrace that.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, we've sort of talked about this. I don't know if we've done it on the air or what, but definitely amongst ourselves that like, honestly, this is a fundamental role of psychology and psychiatry. And one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson says, you got to clean your room, bucko, instead of going and waving a damn placard, because his professional role is to make, broken worker bots into working worker bots. And I mean, in some ways you can't blame him, but also the other individual on the call is Roland Griffiths, who started out this call talking about how he was trained in the school as a radical behaviorist. And so, in that school, changing a behavior is not killing a person. Behavior is the only thing, that matters. And some behaviors are welcome and others are not.
And just so just as that with the manualized kind of approaches to changing identities, we're seeing a lot of times the part of you, if you were thinking through Jordan Peterson and Shapiro's portrayal of being transgender as being confused and having this kind of pathological element of yourself, the way that it's done is in the therapy, identifying that part of you as a parasite on your true self. It's your true self is behind it. And whether it's smoking, whether it's feeling like you're transgender, it explicitly tries to make you disown that and try to be either ashamed of it, maybe not explicitly, but in terms of the way that it's framed, and to try to separate yourself out from it. So I think, Mildred, what you were saying about traumatizing people, and if you look at the history of the non-success of conversion therapy, you see this where it's people come out of it really damaged because it's that they went through this horrible kind of experience about part of themselves that they is there.
And wasn't there a part from the smoking cessation stuff where they were encouraged to view their smoking as a shadow, and
it's part of not just the way that psychedelic smoking cessation is done. It's part of the smoking cessation literature in general that they kind of encourage this disowning of it and seeing smoking as something that's hijacked your nervous system and sort of trying to get back to this pure state that's not that aberration. But when you switch out other kinds of societally deemed aberrations, it is highly problematic. And it's a lot of these scientists are not disciplinarily equipped and not interested in kind of thinking through the implications of trying to fine-tune this technology.
Or even aware of the history where many of these things have already been tried. MK Ultra was the biggest institutional engagement with psychedelics. It still dwarfs what we're doing right now, by a decade. So yeah,
gave us the Unabomber.
Depends on how you want to talk about it.
It also gave us black CIA black site torture methods. Fun stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hey, let's get back in the video.
Alrighty.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think that's a exaggeration or a strengthening of our inbuilt reciprocal ethic? How do you talk to religious people about this, especially if they're more on the conservative end of things? Because a less conservative hypothesis could hardly be imagined, right? It's the psychedelic origin of the deep Judeo-Christian ethic. That's a radical idea. Do we reincorporate it? How do we reincorporate it? And what does that mean on the religious front, the conservative religious front, with regards to, say, practice?
Who knows? I mean, there may be a way to do this with electrocranial stimulation or, other kinds of manipulations.
I'm going to object to that. I don't think your data support it, because you just told me that even the experienced meditators, for them, it's a qualitative transformation. I think the psychedelics are doing something that is in addition to what discipline practice. It isn't obvious to me that this can be duplicated on the non-chemical front.
I don't agree with you. This is the most powerful intervention we have for creating at high probability these kinds of experiences. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to refine this further and that there might not be another way to do it. I've concluded, it sounds to some like an overstatement, but I don't think it is, that actually unpacking this whole situation is crucial to the survival of our species, because that impulse...
Well, that's what the masters of the Eleusinian mysteries proclaimed, that what they're doing, that we would all die without that. We couldn't live without it.
And so if we can understand the kind...
Mm-hmm. Because this just gets back to that ends justifies the means problem that is continuous between the psychedelic mainstreamers and fascists, where it's when you have kind of become fixated on this idea that there is this end goal that's transcends all other goals. Anything else that seems like a problem is, you can justify not paying attention to it. It's like, it's okay that these people are suffering, that these people are being trampled upon, and that things are fundamentally unjust in society, because this broader goal that we're working towards is going to be in everyone's ultimate best interest.
Well, and to that end, I mean, we've sort of been trying to make it untenable not to talk about abuse within psychedelia, and it has shifted certain conversations. For example, at the recent Horizons conference in New York City, right, a bunch of people were like, oh, Matt Johnson, also from Hopkins, Matt Johnson took time to address like harm and abuse. But what did Matt Johnson actually say about harm and abuse? He said, yeah, as we scale, people will get hurt. like there's, and obviously that's a simplification, but fundamentally, like that was one of the core points. Did he say there would be
casualties?
I think, yeah. And so like,
yeah, I don't think that was a simplification. I think that was like the quote, like pretty much.
Okay. Well, but within that realm, I mean, and even if it were like the fact that the fact that people are then holding that up as a substantive, right? People are saying, oh, we're addressing this now. We're saying, yes, people will get hurt, but hey, we're going to bring so much healing to the society that like it's worth it. And my question for all those people continues to be, does that math change if those are people you know? If those are your friends and family, do you suddenly care about if people are getting hurt or not? Or is this just an issue of like abstract, like it's for the greater good?
Mm-hmm.
Back to it?
Back to it.
Experiences that give rise to mutual caretaking, then we have the ability to solve all kinds of horrors that our cultures have imposed on us. You could imagine interfaith dialogues that could come out of exploration of these kinds of experiences across faith traditions, and my guess will be that the discovery is going to be, well, wait a second, the bedrock core, and this is the kind of perennial philosophy, the bedrock core of most of these traditions is really quite similar. Whether the future is integrating this into existing religious institutions or seeing an evolution of our cultural institutions that can incorporate this sort of thing is I think a question. One of the things that is disquieting to me is that the ability of these experiences to shift worldview is potentially really destabilizing to existing cultural institutions.
Yeah, well, that's what happened in the 60s. And it's no wonder there was such, like, we underestimated.
So that was pretty explicitly stated.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things going on. I mean, we saw the perennialism that is rife, in psychedelia. That I think that in our paper we did a good job of finding many counterexamples where you don't end up at the same place just because you take psychedelics, even high doses or special ones or whatever, whether it's DMT or LSD. But also this towards the end of that clip, it just went right out of my head. Somebody else pick it up. Where were we going?
I mean, he's saying the same thing as Rick, right? As far as the perennialism, the notion that there might be some bedrock to this. And it goes back to Peterson's fundamental truth, like the notion that somehow there is some core fundamental truth that is objectively true, that, like this is sort of an antidote to the postmodernists or whatever. And psychedelics will take us there. And then psychedelics, as mediated through religious authorities, will give us a bunch of touchstones for an agreed upon, like a consensus agreement on fundamental truth.
The changing of worldviews, that was it. I mean, because the thing is that I'm not convinced that, aside from maybe making somebody a bit more like mystically inclined, I'm not necessarily convinced that psychedelics aren't in some cases going to amplify and intensify people's pre-existing worldviews. A lot of confirmation of I always suspected that Allah was the one true God, but then he spoke to me, and now I know.
Yeah, well,
yeah, unless
that's
your
why you need to
psychedelic
have-
experience is being strong-armed by a third party,
exactly.
in which like the kind of Roquette style where he's re-educating dissidents or something while they're on psychedelics.
Yeah, when he's talking to Shapiro and he's describing the revelation of like, oh, the wolf gets, this semantic insight into their place in the pack hierarchy. It's like, for someone like Jordan Peterson, who's really into pack hierarchies, that sort of experience like makes sense, but that doesn't prove that pack hierarchies are, representative of the structure of reality.
It's also and like it's further complicated by the fact that that's nonsense that has long discredited the idea that packs have hierarchies. But even if it were the case, why are we basing our sense of human morality based on what wolves do? Wolves do all sorts of shit I don't want to do. Wolves would like eat a baby. I don't want to do that.
Yep.
The magnitude of these processes at our peril.
And I think that accounts for the history of psychedelics having been discovered in some cultures and then forgotten or suppressed. I mean, look what happened when the Spanish came over to Mexico. I mean, they actively stamped out the use of psychedelics. I think at the core, if we're not careful, they can be destabilizing to culture, and then culture is going to come back and demonize them, as is exactly what happened in the 60s. So I am concerned about the excited movement toward decriminalization and legalization.
And so we have to figure out how to place the genie inside the bottle. I mean, this is why what you've done is part of the reason it's so fascinating to me, because for some reason you've been able to get the balance between tradition and discipline and empirical reasoning and careful rationality and skepticism. You balanced that with this intense focus on your own curiosity, your sense of meaning, and brought those together and managed it institutionally. So something that you did worked. It's right. And taking that apart and figuring out how that can be replicated, let's say, that's a crucial future task.
We have to evolve the cultural institutions that can create the containers around these experiences such that they don't threaten our existing institutions, which are going to become reactive and demonize them and shut them down, and figure.
Oh, they both love their walls.
I'm pausing this for a second because this is reminding me of a point I made back in 2018, which was to point out that FDA, the organization that like approves clinical research and is involved in like theoretically like overseeing it and regulating it and all that, is housed in HHS. Like that's the department over that. HHS was also like the department that was overseeing, the whole kids in cages thing. And I know that it's a broad, to seemingly to some like overly abstract argument, but like if your process for achieving societal legitimacy hinges on the same infrastructure that is keeping kids in cages, there may be something wrong with the status quo. Like there may be the notion of like we need to not trouble those institutions doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even merely that it's not that it relies on the same things. It's that it cannot be disruptive to them. If it is even perceived to be disruptive of this process, then yeah.
But it's a
did I
crucial.
Oh, sorry. Go on, Pace.
Oh, just real quick. It's somehow of crucial civilization-saving import that we integrate psychedelics into society, but also nothing should change fundamentally.
I was sort of confused by Roland's point about the wiping out of psychedelic use among like colonized indigenous people. Was he saying that their use of psychedelics threatened the colonists and that was the issue? I wasn't sure where he was going with that.
I mean, in a sense, you could say that like traditional indigenous practices like threatened them in the sense that like it gave them an identity that allowed them to rally against the colonizer, I suppose.
Right.
I think I know what Roland was referring to. And that is there are writings of the Spanish friars of the era, essentially, saying these the sacraments, the teonanactal, which translates to something like the flesh of the gods, like that this is suspiciously close to like our own practice. And so the idea is that they were threatened by it in the sense that if the West was to establish a colony, that the competition of the practices that they viewed as demonic had to be stamped out. I believe that's what Roland was referring to.
Yeah, but just to point to like my understanding of Russell's point was like pointing out that like it's not that it was a problem for culture, it's that it was a problem for this dominating colonial occupation.
No argument here.
Yeah. So if the colonized people had simply said, "Oh no, well we're doing this in a laboratory. It's all perfectly. We're getting the right paperwork," would have been fine.
Yeah.
The intelligent use of these compounds.
When you're doing that as a scientist and now you're inviting religious leaders to participate in that process.
Harvard School of Divinity is initiating a psychedelic chaplaincy program.
That's unbelievable. That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Wow.
Actually,
now that should solve some of their enrollment problems. It's like, look, okay, now you've cottoned onto something here that attracts people. Well, that's to be paid attention to because the church is having a terrible time attracting people, especially young people. And so that can't be ignored. Okay, here's a question.
Oh my God, he
You
admitted.
situate your research project in a cathedral and you administer the psilocybin as a sacrament with the music, with the entire transformation mass apparatus. Because, if it's reasonable to administer it to spiritual leaders, it's reasonable to investigate what happens when you put it in an intense, a lot of work went into a cathedral. A lot of work went into that music, the entire ritual, and the idea of what's actually happening being made explicit. Those experiences are already powerful. God only knows how you might multiply them with the power of all of that imagery and pageantry and tradition and layers of meaning.
we've looked at this under such a narrow range of conditions.
Stop.
We're putting.
Well, this is like the end. I don't know if you want to just like.
Do you want to?
No,
I was going to say let's just.
Let's go on a couch with the eye shades.
Well, you do
and
everything you
headphones.
can to make it sterile, except the music.
Yeah. Well, and we're creating the introverted experience, but we yet to be explored as the extroverted.
I think your work is of what would you say, incalculable import.
It fits so closely with many of the themes that you have developed and advocated for that it's just really exciting to be able to talk to you about it. So thank you.
There it is.
There it is.
There it is.
And boom goes the dynamite.
I think I support the war on drugs now.
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson is full-throatedly behind a version of a psychedelic renaissance that really looks like 15th century Europe, in a cathedral with fancy costumes and incense and music and psilocybin for the masses.
Mildred, there was something, yeah.
It is so fucking bleak. It is so bleak. It is I compared it to the anti-life equation, kind of in jest, but like the more it went on, it's just like that is explicitly what he wants.
Yeah,
is just to be able to overwrite people's will and sublimate them to the what he has determined to be in their best interest.
So what if
under the guise of showing them the transcendent truth,
Yes, yeah.
So because you've commented on how bleak it is, I feel inclined to demonstrate that it may be even bleaker. And I'm curious what your reaction would be
That's
if you
the
learned
Psymposia difference, baby.
What would your reaction be if you learned that one of the largest, more visible sort of cultural projects going on within sort of, you could say, psychedelic content creators is a sort of Jordan Peterson, or it started as a Jordan Peterson fan club called Rebel Wisdom, that promotes a lot of these. They publish screeds against wokeism, sort of
cancel culture.
Yeah, a lot of
critiques
like
of grievance politics or grievance
highly
studies.
reactionary kind of takes, and have increasingly. So they one of their co-founders is the executive director of the Breaking Convention conference in the UK. These tendrils are seemingly quite enmeshed within what is I guess the current psychedelic renaissance.
It's a crisis in meaning making.
Well, I suppose if I were asked how I would react to, hypothetically, to something like that, I would say I simply can't believe it. I simply, unless presented with some sort of evidence, I simply wouldn't believe it. Now I'm just going to take a big sip of water.
Okay, well, first of all, there's an entire channel that you can go check out called Rebel Wisdom. I don't recommend that you do check it out, but if you wanted to know about these things, there are many of Jordan Peterson's ardent followers talking about the import of his contribution to solving the meaning-making crisis, interspersed with conversations about psychedelics and capitalism, interviews with Zen monks or
authoritarian
masters,
Zen monks,
Right.
and weird art about cancel culture with secret buttholes interspersed throughout. So it's an acquired taste, I would imagine, but very much this outfit has has hitched their wagon to Jordan Peterson. It's just indisputable that Rebel Wisdom's genesis came with a documentary about
Series of documentaries.
Jordan Peterson. Series of documentaries called wait for it, A Glitch in the Matrix. This is how we describe Jordan Peterson's rise. And spends a lot of time talking about the problem of wokeism and what grievance studies
social
really
justice warriors.
To do. Right.
Yeah. Jordan Peterson, famous for his love of rebellion. Yeah.
And meanwhile, this outfit that is, peddling reactionary ideologies around psychedelics is simultaneously kind of, co-opting analyses that people on the Psymposia team, recuperating, that's the one, have done about sort of like taking the anti-capitalism critiques that people like Dave have been developing while kind of cleansing them of any association with actually radical politics, and then advancing themselves as the kind of center of this discourse. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but
you buff off the pokey edges that you take the anti out of the capitalism thing and you say there's some problems with capitalism, we could do it better, let's talk about it, with me and my real original ideas, like the psychedelic Trojan horse, which I don't know where that idea came from. There's a lot of sort of repackaging of ideas that are not acknowledged, that have been generated elsewhere, and then sort of selling them back to their larger audience that has already drunk the Peterson tea. We've talked about them a couple of times on our channel.
Maybe the Peterson hot water, but
not so much Peterson. Yeah,
bone broth.
But yeah, and I mean we've engaged directly at some point on Twitter, and it hasn't been productive, shall we?
I think one of the things that I'm concerned about, and that I'm curious for some of your takes as I guess we could say content creator who deals with some of these dynamics, is that like it it's not quite entryism. It feels like it's adjacent to entryism, where it's like they've used those sorts of approaches to foster relationships with other. So, for example, there's another organization named Chacruna that likes to put out a lot of lip service about indigenous reciprocity, this, that, and the other. They've got an indigenous reciprocity initiative that is funded by the same corporations that are actively exploiting indigenous knowledge, land bases, what have you. And so, like, seeing some of these strange bedfellows, shall we say, popping up around these sort of defanged analysis or analyses that they're sort of peddling as the response to commodification, to capitalism entering psychedelia in big ways. Like, I'm just curious what, if any, dynamic strategies, approaches you've found helpful for dealing with those kinds of media projects.
Well, to be honest, this is an area I see that, like, everyone I know who does the same kind of thing I do, and as you do as well, there is a concerning rise in this type of this pattern, and, like, I would put it all under the umbrella of a kind of red-brown alliance. That like the degree to which they have capitalized on the fact that for a number of people, they want the aesthetic of being rebellious, of standing up to, but they realize on some level, well, wait a minute, all of these systems benefit me. So if I actually hurt them, then, like, that could backfire on me. So what I want is to preempt it by saying that, like, actually, no, the ones that serve me are fine. It's the other ones that actually hurt people. And it's like, you see, like, gray zone media or people like that. It's like this idea that, like, wokeism is infecting the left, and it's like, no, they're just trying to distract from, like, the battle against imperialism. And if you actually want to be an anti-imperialist, you have to be patriotic to the United States. And it's like, it's just nonsense. It's just oppositional. You're just taking whatever everyone else is saying and saying the opposite to give the appearance of being an iconoclast, while not actually standing for anything.
I think you hit the nail right on the head, and I have a brief example, which is that Chacruna recently, in some emailer, shared Rebel Wisdom's video on psychedelics and capitalism. That was what they shared, right? I think that's what it was.
So did Maps.
Yeah,
right.
Maps
So you have Chacruna, an outfit that really has planted its flag in the identity politics hill, sharing the content of the anti-wokeism grievance studies psychedelic wing of the movement, and it's nonsensical, but
except
the way that you're talking about things, it fits in just fine.
They both serve the same ends ultimately.
And one of the things you can look out for if you're trying to identify people like this, and you can see this in Jordan Peterson, by the way, is this tendency to always talk about how people don't want you to speak. People are trying to stop you. And anyone who disagrees with you, or anyone who's saying or who says something counter to what you believe, is only doing that to discredit. Like, if people cotton on to your out there ideas, like, they won't buy the bullshit anymore. It's this conspiratorial secret knowledge that, that's why it's so important that you support me, because they're out there trying to silence me, folks. They're trying to cancel me.
So the really funny thing, and again, I think you've hit it on the head. The thing that I find so, like, the aha moment in hearing you say that is, as with all of the Substack millionaires who have been canceled, right? Like, Chacruna and Rebel Wisdom literally run legs of the conference circuit. Like, these are the people who are producing some of the largest, most visible, at least long-standing psychedelic events. Meanwhile, Psymposia has, as a result of advancing radical critiques, largely been frozen out of those spaces, pushed to the margin, forced to hell. Why do you think we sold out to Vox in New York, man? Because nobody in the space would listen. And so it was like, look, you fuckers, here you go.
But also, you don't use the fact that there's that pushback as evidence for your position, right?
No, we double down on the critique in advance.
Yeah. You show your position, you let it speak for itself.
Totally.
And then you might bring up the fact that there is that pushback, right? Because it's a part of the story, but you don't you don't take that pushback and go, well, what are they trying to hide? You know, you're showing them. You're saying, here, this is what they're trying to hide. Look, look. See this? They're trying to hide it.
So I guess,
and that's true. And it's one of the, like, in some ways, I'm not at all surprised that, as a critical watchdog, that the people that we are critical of would rather not we exist. I get that, you know. But as Dave has pointed out, you know, at the point where some of our partnerships extend to Vox, and our critiques are getting published in peer-reviewed, outlets and such, Psymposia has been really successful in using the radical flanking technique of just marshaling the conversation in directions. So it doesn't always happen the way we would like it to happen, but point is love us or hate us, you can't ignore us, you know.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the questions, you know, like, because I hear you loud and clear on identifying it, and I think it's part of the reason it's great to be in dialogue with you and other like content creators outside of psychedelia who are still interested in psychedelics. And I think the question that comes to mind around a lot of this is, like, in addition to trying to strengthen some of those relationships and build sort of broader types of affinity and relationship, like, what sort of strategies for dealing with, these kinds of projects that seemingly attempt to, like, suck some of the energy out of the room?
Well, just real quick for like the out, because I don't want to put any kind of identity or belongingness or non-belongingness in terms of like identifying like as within or without psychedelia, because I think psychedelia should encompass like the people who are not, at the conferences.
Sorry, yeah, I just meant that.
I just wanted to emphasize
absolutely.
that, like, we want to shift like what our psychedelia is to not just be about trying to constantly make headway with reactionaries.
100%.
It's like whenever I have conflict with another leftist content creator, people will say one of us or the other of us isn't a genuine leftist, and it's like, no, it's just that one of us is a dipshit. It's like, it doesn't mean we're not leftists. Like, some leftists are dipshits and assholes. Like, it's just, your space is not immune to that. And I think you really lose something when you don't reflect on that, or this no true Scotsman notion of like, if they believe certain things, then they can't be, they're not like me. I have the good beliefs, and it just means you never introspect, like it's
right. I would also say though that I think it's good, for a movement to be a little bit more charitable to people who do share your fundamental beliefs, in the hope that being a dipshit is a temporary thing,
Sure.
Whereas if somebody, like, what we see a lot in this like movement of psychedelia to mainstream everything is actually extreme charity being extended to like actual fascists, to try and get their demographic on board. And then anybody who's got like a critique that says maybe actual fascists are not a good thing to reach out to, a lot of venom being put this way. So I say be a little bit more charitable to people who at least espouse similar core beliefs. Why not?
Yeah, and at the same time, I shouldn't have to sit at a table in good faith with people who want me dead.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
And I think just like part of our larger interest is definitely like connecting with leftists who aren't willing to sacrifice people on the altar of this ends justifies the means logic, people who are kind of aware of the dangers of seeding psychedelics and the kind of frameworks of mainstreaming psychedelics to fascists and people who are aligned with fascists, and just trying to kind of push forward other visions, like in our last conversation where we're talking about, the commons and non-hierarchical ways and potentials for using psychedelics in community and as community building tools, and for, detaching yourself from hegemonically imposed concepts of what you should be, as opposed to doing the reverse.
Yeah.
And should we end with the end of the Shapiro clip, because it just points to the fact that this isn't just fun and games, and there are stakes here that are quite serious.
Yeah, so that is queued up and ready to go. I'm not sure if I have it on the exact right timestamp, but it should be like 91 minutes. I think is that first mention of...
Perfect.
Before I forget, I have to point this out because it was incredibly funny to me. In the beginning of this Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson clip, Ben Shapiro walks into the coffee shop, and it's like there's a camera crew there with multiple cameras. Like, obviously they've set this up, and he tries to play it like, "Hey man, how's it going? Good to see you." Like, he comes here every day and he knows this guy and he's involved in this guy's life. He's a real human being with connections, just like you. He talks to the little people. He's just like you. And the barista asks him, "What's your name for the cup?" And it's just, it's so good. It's so good because, like, he's very famous. Like, anyone off the street would know who Ben Shapiro is. But, like, for him to, like, know that this is happening, know that there's a camera crew, and go like, "You just pretended to know me, that we've seen each other, and it's good for you to see me," and for me to say, "I don't know your name," is just so good.
Yeah, true.
All right, so you said like 90. Well, I don't have
They don't understand. They don't understand. They do not understand. They push too hard and shit's going to get real.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the guys I was talking to today, one of Greg's Democrats, he said, he's talking about the right wing, and he said, well, the conservatives are scared. And I wrote him, I said, they don't have guns because they're scared. Like, don't mistake this. It's not fear. If anything, it's more like contempt.
Yeah, no, contempt is right. I mean, especially now that I live in Florida, I got to tell you, like, for us, it's like they were saying, so DeSantis has like a National Guard thing, right? And 23 states have it. And so CNN had this whole thing about how DeSantis, he's forming a National Guard, personally loyal to him, and all this kind of garbage, right? And so, you know what? You guys screw with us, we will be greeted as liberators.
Yeah.
Like, half of our state is New Yorkers anyway. We'll just march right up the coast, and Ron DeSantis will be mayor of New York. Like, we are fine with that if you want a piece of that.
Hey, I'm coming to Florida. They gave me the Roger Scruton Award. It's the first.
So.
Totally nothing fashy there.
Yeah. Just a personal
contempt. We have guns because we hold the rest of you in contempt.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if you think back to that meme with the soldiers and the beach, it's sort of like when the beach gets too comfortable and the people on the beach get, look above their station in life and feel like they can start being uppity and challenging things. It's like those guns that are trained on the perimeter, suddenly that is the target that needs to be taken out to keep the beach up. So it justifies that violence.
Mm-hmm. Good hard men make good times make soft men make bad times make hard men.
Yeah, Joe Rogan.
Yeah, Joe Rogan 2021.
So yeah, it's not fun and games here.
Yeah, well thank you.
Fun note to end.
Yeah, I mean, it's
once
just
more into the bleak. Sorry.
Yeah. Just one last thing is like, I think that there are a lot of awesome potentials for psychedelics and healing, and for, because I was a basket case growing up, and, well, I'm not saying I'm entirely put together now, but, I was like, I couldn't handle being in social situations. I would have panic attacks and break down, and I kept having all of these. I wasn't fitting with what I felt like I was supposed to be in society. And then, I was freed from that, and I was able to be okay with being myself and not fitting into certain kinds of rigid binaries and all the rest. And there's so much potential there for helping people disentangle themselves from hegemonic social systems. And so I want to just emphasize that at the end, that there is this hope and this positive potential, but currently the people that are being funded to lead the psychedelic renaissance and the revolution are doing so under incredibly alarming circumstances that need to be challenged.
And we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't think there was some merit or something worth like fighting for, right? Like, I mean, otherwise, like, why the hell spend all this time in the I'm trying to a cesspit. I didn't want to say toxic sludge again. I'm trying to learn and grow.
Thank you for respecting my culture. But the I think something that sometimes goes unsaid that I think we is worth acknowledging is that like these guys are really good at this, and not everyone that they fool is on board with their ideological project. A lot of people are duped. So it isn't that we're saying that if you read 12 Rules for Life and it had some positive effect on you, that you are a latent fascist, or that you are like sympathetic to a fascist or Nazi worldview. It's not it at all. It's that guys like Jordan Peterson get into spaces based on like just people's good willingness to give them that charity, and then use that to forward their nefarious agenda. So
I would say that the reason why we're here with my friend Jordan Peterson is the title of the clips with Ben Shapiro, is that Jordan Peterson no longer has the plausible deniability that he used to have, that he said, oh, I'm a classical liberal. He's no longer able to do that. And so he says, okay, well, I'm going to double down and consolidate the audience that I have access to at this point. But before then, he represented himself as a centrist.
And part of what that we were talking about this during a quick break, part of what is appealing for a lot of people about Jordan Peterson is his pushback against neoliberal capitalist identity politics, which is a problem where you just, you take the most pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist Black person and you give them power and you act like that's change. Like that is not change. That is not just doing things based on categories alone is not going to fix any underlying problems in society. And so a lot of people see the kind of Coca-Cola version of identity politics, the corporate, the white fragility, what are the classes that they do about kind of getting white people to self-flagellate,
the corporate diversity training,
interiority.
And in the interest of inclusion, I just wanted to mention, the Kylie Jenner, Pepsi,
right? Yeah,
corporate identity politics as well. Please,
I'm sure somewhere there's a Raytheon executive doing a land acknowledgement.
Right. Exactly.
Oh, absolutely.
Exactly. So it's like I think it's really important for leftists, and Dave has a great. Maybe we can link some of the examples, but can you just mention some of the like Taiwo's?
Oh yeah, like I mean, I think Olufemi Taiwo's being in the room privilege essay on epistemic deference and like acknowledging that like people's positionality in society gives insight into certain experiences, but he makes the point in the essay that like suffering is not finishing school. Trauma can teach things, but that's not necessarily the takeaway from traumatic experiences. And he points as well to he concludes like pointing to basically like a call for affinity and solidarity, and like the things that the struggles that we face, the difficulties, the challenges, the marginalizations, like so many of us have different intersections of those experiences, that they should serve as bridges, not walls. And that like when we realize that politics are essentially like power relations, like the notion of an increasingly fragmented identity politics, like at the end of the day, like we're just talking about politics, and like a willingness to extend across those seeming divides is I think what's necessary for like an actual ongoing, whatever radical politics that can challenge particularly like the recuperative notion that like things can get better because your Exxon board is the most diverse board one could possibly imagine. Like it has to come back to structural realities, and it needs that intersectional, race, class, et cetera, analysis.
Yeah. Taiwo has a new book coming out called Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else.
We're working on getting him on for an episode.
Yeah,
we'd love it.
Because like, a lot of people that just don't have exposure to that leftist intersectional approach to things, like they register something's wrong with the corporate identity politics, and then they hear Jordan Peterson, they're like, thank you, someone is pushing back, and then it's this like, that's just, they just go with that. So I think advancing the leftist perspective is going to be really important. And also acknowledging just that, and that's just real quick, Chacruna really capitalizes on that corporate identity politics. And it's like, that's part of how they get ahead in the space. But last thing about Jordan Peterson, in terms of like people, we're not to shame people who get stuff out of him. Like I've listened to a lot of Jordan Peterson, as part of my work. And I've gotten some benefit from aspects of, like working on my book project, like some of what he talks about in terms of like working like, consistently every day and not kind of getting distracted by your narratives about what it is you're doing and your self-worth, and just showing up and the work will follow. Like things like that are beneficial. Sure. And they're not from him. They come from like the literature on,
7 Habits for Highly Effective People.
Right. Right. So it's like, but for some people, they see how that he's helpful in some circumstances, and that becomes some kind of a stamp of authenticity on his genius as a whole. And then they kind of are brought in to assume that the rest of it is right and true as well.
Yeah, it's this totalizing view of people. And I know this is kind of ironic because I did compare him to Darkseid earlier, but he is like a human being who is capable of doing good things. He is not a literal monster,
That's the thing about humans, right? Like they never are, right? Like
hang on. You're doing a disservice to Jordan Peterson, who says you should become a monster and then learn to control it. So he'd be a little bit offended if you said that he wasn't a monster, and I want to give him that.
I'm okay with offending Jordan Peterson. I think of the things I've said about him. If that's the one that gets to him, I don't know. I think I've said a lot of worse things about it today, even.
Well, shall
but
we?
He had just seen Avengers Endgame when he said that. He was just like,
the Hulk. He's really tamed the beast within.
Oh my god!
With that, yeah. When you said monsters, I thought of like Where Kermit the Frog, but
yeah.
Well, thanks.
Should we end
so
on
much.
Where Kermit?
Sounds good.
Yeah, thank you again to Mildred for joining us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, especially for such an extended
always a pleasure.
ramble.